We held our annual general meeting this morning for members, and so it's a special pleasure to welcome friends from the wider independence movement this afternoon to exchange views and to hear from our panel of distinguished speakers. CIB was founded in 1969 before we joined the EEC and has always been a cross-party organisation comprising a wide range of political views but always united in the aim of restoring democratic self-government and independence. In 1972, in spite of valiant efforts by our founders, we failed to stop the passing of the European Communities Act by a very narrow margin. And what a lot of trouble we would have been saved if only we could have persuaded those few MPs to the sense of their proper duty. Now, last year, I remarked that this year's rally would be the last one held under our EU captivity, as the government had served the Article 50 notice, and in accordance with its terms, the treaties would cease to apply from the 29th of March 2019 at the latest. But I had to add, unless the European Council, in agreement with the member state concerned, unanimously decides to extend this period, Clause 3 of Article 50, one of the few documents of the EU which is fairly easy to understand. Well, it appears that the government and the European Council have agreed to extend this period, a transition period according to the European Council, or a implementation period according to Mrs. May. And it will be extended by 21 months, we are told, but it can be extended further by joint agreement. So this 48th annual meeting and rally of the Campaign for an Independent Britain will not be the last one under de facto subjection to the EU laws, even if the Article 50 notice period has de jure expired. Now, the newsletter before this rally went out to members before the announcement of this development, which was rather less triumphal than the press and media reports suggested, more or less a matter of just kicking the can down the road. Now, of recent months, I've found that Private Eye, its Brussels sprouts column, has become very concise and accurate. The most recent one, on page 11 of the present edition, sums things up pretty well. It says, "The impression of a breakthrough on all things from future trade to the 21-month transition is false. A deal is no closer, and the Northern Irish border question is as vexed as ever. In substance, the Irish border dispute has always appeared synthetic. Officials on both sides have recognised the reality of the new land border from the start. While the EU argues that Northern Ireland must remain aligned with the EU on goods to avoid border controls, and Brexiteer ultras claim that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs can solve everything with an electronic pre-clearance system, UK ministers accept that this would not obviate the need for border inspections." What they call a hard border, in other words. Well, it's not hard, it will just be a stop for some inspections. Having said that no British Prime Minister could ever agree to the EU's backstop terms, the Prime Minister quietly accepted it, should the two sides fail to reach a better agreement. And that has been the pattern with the Article 50 process all the way through. The EU tables a proposal that is angrily rejected and then quietly and substantially agreed to later. With the EU making the running on almost every thorny subject, it's no surprise that Davis and company are chasing the game. And the proposals for what the EU calls the transition period are very thorny indeed. Truly a vassal state situation, with the EU helplessly subject to every jot and comma of existing EU law, and anything they choose to spring on us in the meantime, subject to the sole interpretation of the European Court of Justice, and I say again, and do not forget, capable of being extended. Now, for most of the years of our long struggle, I and most campaigners thought that leaving would be some great and glorious single event when Britannia waives the rules. Well, the European Union and other affected states would then agree, and we would continue our commercial relationships with them more or less as at present, but as an independent country. Now we realise it is much more complex, and there will have to be a series of steps. Now, in the run-up to the referendum, I was talking to one of our most determined, long-serving campaigners about what might happen afterwards. I said, we can't just haul up the anchor and sail away. And this lady, as I said, a very determined lady, said, oh, I do wish we could. And it was deeply heartfelt, and it's a feeling which I can fully sympathise, having been opposed to membership myself since 1972. We abhor our subjection to the European project, but would do well to remember who brought this evil upon us. The EU does have a dark side, but in its various stages has always been pretty straightforward about its objective of political union. And I would like to refer you here to a quotation from 1947 in a pamphlet which was called Design for Europe. And it said, no government dependent on a democratic vote could possibly agree in advance to the sacrifice that any adequate plan must involve. The British people must be led slowly and unconsciously into the abandonment of their traditional economic defences. That was written by Peter Thorneycroft, later Chancellor of the Exchequer and Chairman of the Conservative Party. And it was a really profound insult to the British people who had spent all of their treasure and much blood fighting a war to preserve freedom and democratic self-government for themselves and others, and they were to be led slowly and unconsciously into a completely different form of government of which they were to be kept in ignorance. That is the arrogance of the British promoters of the European project from the beginning. It is our own political class where the real evil, sly, manipulative authoritarianism has lain, not so much with the EU itself, which was always going to do what it's done. The EU could have taken nothing from us without this deliberate concealment at the highest level of the state by our own people who were sworn by the most solemn oath to uphold our sovereignty. And much of it was done not only in arrogance, but later in ignorance as well. Time and again, at various crises, the governments of the EU countries would say to their British colleagues that they should go home and read the treaties, which they or their predecessors had signed. Our leaders had not even bothered to do their homework and find out what they were signed up to. That's the negligence and contempt in which they held us and our rights and freedoms. Recent events suggest that making good this ignorance is still necessary if we are to extricate ourselves in the most advantageous way, ensuring the smooth continuity of trade on both sides, upon which the prosperity of both depends. Businesses have to pay wages and their bills every week, and it's no use having some splendid, glorious conception of our ideal final terms of independence without knowing the steps we have to take to get there, minimizing disruption and giving businesses timely advice so that they can adapt. Another Europhile, a rather more straightforward character, Lord Hattersley, was fairly plain speaking about this on a BBC programme back in 2000. He said, not only was it wrong for us to deal superficially with what Europe involved, but we have paid the price for it ever since, because every time there is a crisis in Europe, people say, with some justification, well, we would not have been part of this if we had known the implications. Well, I think that's the nearest thing to an apology which I've ever heard from a politician. Well, people did realise the implications and gave their verdict in the referendum. Now, these quotations are the first and last quotations from our CIB booklet, A House Divided, one of the series on sale today. Now, all of these are deeply researched, written in clear, moderate terms, and have been very handsomely designed by my colleague, Deputy Chairman Philip Foster here. We still have a job on our hands, educating our MPs and peers on the size of the hole they've dug us into and how to get us out of it. We cannot do this without informed campaigners to remind them. Now, whilst we don't claim infallibility, we are sure that any campaigner who takes the trouble to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest these pamphlets will be better informed than many MPs and ministers, as evidenced by many elementary mistakes that we see in the press and media every day. And it's up to us to urge and help MPs deliver what Parliament already agreed by a large majority to deliver the independent settlement, the verdict of the people in the referendum, and no ifs and buts about that. It is their duty and privilege to be the people's servants. I'm now going to ask Philip to describe these pamphlets. As I say, they're well researched and presented in a most attractive way. And remember, please, that they are all ammunition, effective weapons of mass liberation, powerful if you master them. And we can provide them, but you need to know well and practice how to handle them. Well-informed MPs and peers will then have no excuse for the ignorance and muddled thinking, feigned or real, behind which they've hidden for so long and far too long. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you.